Hello and welcome to Chapter 14, the heart and heart disease. When we look at the heart, we are going to first off look at the structure of the heart, the layers, the chambers, and the blood supply, and also the valves. Very important. It's very important you know all these in great detail. Then we're going to look at the function in terms of the contraction and the output. Briefly look at disease. Then we are going to look at heart studies briefly. We're going to spend a lot of time on the ECG because the ECG helps you describe the muscular and the electrical activities of the heart, and we will look at those in details. Very briefly, we'll discuss heart disease and treatment and aging. You'll get that later. We'll look quickly at artery disease. Okay? So when you look at terms for the heart, you see there's a lot of angio. Angio has to do with the blood vessels. Then you also have corno words. Peri words means around, cardium words. Look at the roots, and they're important there. Now, the whole idea of the circulatory system is it's a continuous one-way circuit of blood vessels through which the blood is pumped by the heart. The heart's a very important pump. The heart is located right inside the thoracic cavity. Notice that the left lung only has 2 lobes as opposed to the right lung, which has 3 lobes. So that way your heart is a little more towards the left. The apex is sort of the point of the heart. Very important when orienting the heart because one side of the heart is thicker than the other, and we'll look at that when we look at the myocardium a little later. And it's in the mediastinum. Mediastinum is its own little cavity. It's divider there. So we'll look at that. Now, when we look at the layers of the heart wall, layers of heart wall is very straightforward in terms of labeling. Epi means outside. So the epicardium is outside, and it is actually continuous with the pericardium. Perium means around, epi means on top or outside. So the outside, the epicardium, has the pericardium, which is this sac outside of it. Notice the pericardium is sort of double layered and it folds back on itself. You've got the visceral pericardium. Anytime you have a visceral word, it means next to the gut. Parietal means more towards the chest cavity. So you have the visceral pericardium and the parietal pericardium. Very fibrous, a way of protecting the heart. Then you have epi, outside, endo, inside. Very smooth inside to allow for blood flow. Smooth, frictionless blood flow. We'll talk about veins and valves later. And some tendons which hold the valves in place in a bit when we talk about valves. Then myo means muscle, myocardium. Now, if you remember when we talked back about muscle, different types of muscle, cardiac muscle is a specific type of muscle. The myocardium or cardiac muscle is striated. You can see the stripes here. When we talk about muscle contractions, those are the Z lines. There's also these intercalated discs, and that helps in the communication of the contraction of it. You also have sort of branching, and you have nuclei sort of in throughout it. So when you look at the features, lightly striated, single nuclear cells, controlled involuntarily, which is good, and you've got branching muscle. Very important in the structure of the myocardium. Now, when it comes to looking at the heart, there's a bunch of parts, and you need to have them all memorized, but I want you to memorize them in terms of how the blood flows through the heart, and because often the heart itself is hard to determine until you look at what's going in it. What chamber is it? Is it a collecting chamber? Is it a pumping chamber? Is it on the left or the right? Just to get started, I initially said that the apex is off to the patient's left, so it's all right. Notice when you're labeling the heart, it is as in the patient. So all right is the patient's left. The left side is a little stronger. That's because this is the side that pumps to the body. It needs to be stronger than the side that pumps to the lungs. I'll talk about that in a bit, but first off, I want you to look at the embryonic heart, because once you look at how the heart forms embryonically, it makes a little more sense as why this is all twisted. Now, if you look at the unit plan, so this is unit plan C. If you look at heart and heart disease, there's many objectives. The one we're looking at here is the embryonic heart development video, and these videos will help give you ideas and ways to help learn the heart and the parts of the heart. Okay, when you click on this embryonic heart development video, you get this video here. I'm starting at a part way in. This is an embryo. This purple is the nerve cord and the red is the heart. Starting a part way in because I want you to look at how the heart forms and why it is looped back on itself.
Back to day 18 and watch this happen from a different viewpoint. Here are two tubes in our embryo's chest region seen from a front view. Watch this. Over the next 2 days, these tubes fuse together. Here's another amazing part. The tube now starts bending and twisting, and over the next 8 days, it forms a simple version of the heart. By the time the embryo becomes a fetus at 2 months, the heart bears a close resemblance to what it will look like after the baby's born.
Okay, the reason why the heart folds back on itself and the vessels come out of the top is because of this folding at day 18, day 20. It folds up and down. So it is kind of looped through, and all the great vessels come out of the top. So it's really tricky because most of the diagrams we look at the heart are two-dimensional, but we're dealing with a three-dimensional heart. Okay, we'll also go and talk about the other fetal differences in a bit, but let's go back to the picture of the heart. When you are looking at the heart itself, please consider the pathway of the blood in doing the memorizing. Don't just memorize stuff for the sake of memorizing it, because it needs to have meaning to it. So let's look at the pathway. Superior vena cava as opposed to inferior vena cava. The vena cavas are the large blood veins that take the blood to the heart. Veins to the heart, arteries away from the heart. Okay, arteries away. The vena cava, superior is above, inferior is below. So the superior vena cava will empty the heart and, the head and the arms. It will collect in the atrium. Atrium are collecting chambers. Atrium are collecting chambers. The right atrium will do the main collecting from the body. It then goes through the right atrial ventricular valve to the ventricle. Notice the valves have many names. They have the classic name. So this is the right atrial ventricular valve and the left atrial ventricular valve. However, they also have the older or standard name. So this is the tricuspid valve. And when you look at the tricuspid valve, it actually has 3 parts to it, 3 cusps, as opposed to the bicuspid valve, which is also called the mitral valve on the left. Okay, tricuspid valve. As the blood goes through the atrium, from the atrium into the ventricle, it goes through the tricuspid valve. We'll talk a little bit more about valves in the next unit, but valves are made for one-way flow, sort of like a gate. There are these little tendons, chordae tendineae, which will prevent the valves from flowing backwards or flopping backwards. It is the closing of these valves that cause the heart sound, but it's not a sound like a clanging or slamming of a door. It's more like when you pull the plug out of the bathtub. When you pull the plug out of the bathtub, there's a noise. That is the movement of the fluid. The heart sounds, the lub and the dub, which we'll talk about later, the lub and the dub are related to the movement of the fluid through the valves, not the clanging of the valves themselves. Okay. Atrium, ventricle, and then out. On the right side, you are collecting the blood from the body, so it has to go to the lungs to be oxygenated before it goes anywhere else. So it goes through the what are called the semilunar valves. There are two sets of semilunar valves: a pulmonary valve, which goes to pulmonary. Anything pulmonary is a lung word. So the pulmonary valve is the valve going to the lungs. The pulmonary trunk is the big trunk that goes to the lungs. The pulmonary artery, arteries mean away. They are the blood vessels that take the blood away from the heart to the lungs. Then in the lungs, it gets oxygenated. Chapter 18, respiratory system. Oxygen comes in, carbon dioxide goes out, yada, yada, yada. Now, on the way out, you normally hear the fact that arteries have the most oxygen. That is wrong. And the reason it's wrong is because of this exception of the pulmonary trunk. Pulmonary artery is leaving the heart and going to the lungs, so it is where the lowest concentration of oxygen is. The blood is then oxygenated in the lungs, in the left and the right lung. So it will come back from the lungs to the heart, so it is a vein. To the heart is a vein. It is the vein from the lung, so it is the pulmonary vein. And you have a left lung and a right lung, so the one that comes from the left is the left pulmonary lung. They collect in the left atrium. Atrium are collecting chambers. They're not very muscular because they just collect. And then small contraction and poof, you are dumped into the ventricle. So you go in from the atrium to the ventricle through the left atrial ventricular valve or the mitral valve, also called the bicuspid valve. This is the valve that most people have valve heart trouble with. So this is during heart sounds. You will have a murmur. It's this valve, the mitral valve, usually. Here are the chordae tendineae, which is a Latin sounding way for cord tendons. The chordae tendineae, and notice the spelling, there's a lot of vowels at the end. The chordae tendineae anchor the valves to the heart wall so that way they don't flip backwards, giving the valves one-way flow. Very important for efficiency, one-way flow. You then go into the ventricle, the left ventricle, and once the ventricles contract, the blood will go out of the left ventricle into the aorta. So the valve going into the aorta is called the aortic valve, also classified as a semilunar because I guess it looks like half a moon. You go to the semilunar, you are going to the ascending aorta, the aorta arch, and then the aorta actually continues down the body, so it becomes the descending aorta later on. Before the aorta descends down, there are 3 arteries that come off it, which we'll talk about later in the artery unit, but one goes to the arm, and then you've got the head and the arms coming off here. So this is how your head and arms get oxygenated. Okay, very tricky, but please make sure you memorize all these parts and you memorize them in a logical order, so this way you're thinking about it in terms of the activity with the heart, not just memorizing stuff. We got all them. Oh, interventricular septum. Septum is a dividing word. Inter means between, so this is the divider between the septum. Notice you have septums in your body. You got a septum in your nose, so septum's just a dividing word. Okay, and we've got them all. High in oxygen, low in oxygen because it comes from the body, goes to the lungs, comes back high in oxygen. So here is an example of a vein, the pulmonary vein, that is high in oxygen. So the true definition of artery is away from the body. True definition of vein is the vessel coming towards the body. So we've talked about all the valves. Make sure you know the valves. When you look at the valves, here's what they look like in terms, actually this is a very bad diagram, but the valves are there to help you. The myocardium itself is oxygenated by the coronary arteries and the cardiac vein. So if you're having a coronary, that means your arteries are not getting blood. So if you look on the outside of the diagram here, here are red is coronary, blue are cardiac. And here we have a nice, basically you'll just The only way to tell is based on the location. Oh, end of video 1.